بسم الله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I would like to start off by first thanking the Islamic University of Technology, SIKS, for arranging this webinar and inviting me to give a presentation on this important subject. And I would also like to extend my thanks to all the listeners, whether you're listening live or will be listening to a recording of the session later. I want to thank you for showing interest in this topic, as it's an especially important one for those engaged in da'wah to be familiar with. Now, as I move forward along into my presentation, I will be referring to the notion of believing in God without religion as deism. That way, we have a clear and simplified single term we could use to allude to this phenomenon. Now, to be forthright, deism is a specific kind of non-religious belief in God, but the substantive core elements of deism, as I'll explain later, inshallah, are predominantly found in most, if not all, conceptions of non-religious beliefs in God. So the agenda of this presentation today, we'll first start off by defining what deism is, and then we'll briefly discuss the historical development of deism, and we'll briefly touch upon the relevance of deism today in our times. And then we're going to be advancing 3 different critiques of deism, and then inshallah we will conclude with some final remarks. So what is deism? Well, deism can be defined as the belief that God created yet remains uninvolved in the world, and that man should only accept religious and moral knowledge obtainable through the strict use of reason. So deism can be defined as the belief in a God who chooses not to intervene or be involved in the affairs of his creation. And in light of that, deism asserts that God does not send divine revelation to his creation, and it denies the existence of miracles because it maintains that God does not intervene in the natural world order in any way. Moreover, deism stresses the importance of human reason. Any religious knowledge, any moral knowledge of halal and haram that you wish to obtain can only be obtained through the strict use of reason. So, in a nutshell, deism is the belief in a God who created the universe and chose to never intervene or be involved in it. That this God is disinterested, he is disinterested in the universe, and it teaches that we must rely on our reason alone in order to deduce what this God demands from us, if he demands anything at all. Now, what we need to bear in mind that deists are not monolithic. So despite that definition that I just gave, we should note that deists do disagree with each other on a host of theological issues. So for example, is there an afterlife? And if there is one, is there divine judgment in this afterlife? Is there a path to salvation? What is the purpose of life? What kind of attributes does God have? Is God a good God or is he an evil God, etc.? So deists have historically tended to disagree with each other on these critical questions. However, despite these differences, the definition of deism that I just offered is a fundamental belief shared by all of them, and thus helps guide our discussion on the subject. A brief history of deism. The classical Sunni Islamic scholars across the theological spectrum, they refuted a religious sect that they identified as the Barahima, or Brahmins in English. And this religious sect, which were based in India, they were pantheists who denied that God sends prophets. And they also argued for the sufficiency of human reason for deducing our moral codes. Today, we can benefit from the rebuttals that our classical Islamic scholars raised against the Barahima in our debates and discussions today against modern deists, as modern deists hold core views similar to those of the Barahima, whom our classical scholars refuted. However, we need to bear something in mind, academically speaking. Now, even though we can find early traces of people and religions adopting beliefs similar to deists, like the Barahima, the term deism has a very specific academic meaning and reference. So in academia, it specifically refers to that movement whose emergence we could trace back to the late 17th century during the English Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment was a major intellectual movement that strongly emphasized the importance of reason and the freedom of people to choose their own religious or non-religious worldviews. It stressed the importance of notions such as tolerance and rationality and scientific inquiry and secularism and so on. So deism was easily palatable to the Enlightenment thinkers, as deism facilitated for them the ability to emphasize the importance of reason and be strongly opposed to the theological doctrines of Christianity, which they deemed to be incoherent. Moreover, it was during this period that world exploration voyages exposed the Europeans to different religions and people from different religious backgrounds. And over time, the idea of religious salvific pluralism also started influencing them, as they began to think that it did not make sense for God to punish all of these non-Christians in hell for simply not having accepted the Christian gospel. And so the Enlightenment served as a critical backdrop for the development and spread of deism. And until today, deism is still around and adopted by people who may not even call themselves deists, let alone even know what deism even is, though it's precisely what they are in reality. Deism today. So, I mean, just a few things to look at here. So on the left side of the screen, you could see some findings from a Pew Research study that was conducted a few years ago. And basically this, they asked ex-Muslims what were the reasons why they left Islam. And you could see that in the top, you would see that don't like organized religion received one of the highest scores. So a lot of these people who left Islam did not necessarily leave because they stopped believing in God, or because they got attracted to another religion, or rather because they got fed up with the idea of religion altogether. And on the top right side of the screen, you could see a Facebook page in Arabic belonging to Arab deists, like an Arab deist group. And on the bottom right, you could see an article that discusses the rise of deism in Turkey. And so the only reason why I'm showing this is to just highlight, and I'm sure there's strong anecdotal evidence that all of us are probably familiar with that reinforces the idea that deism is emerging in different pockets of the Muslim world, and it's an idea that we need to contend with. So with that said, I think we can move on to our first argument, which is basically deism's incoherence considering God's wisdom. So what I'm going to do is that I'm first going to lay out the argument, and then I'm going to elaborate on it. Okay, so this is the argument. So first premise number one: wisdom necessitates acting in a meaningfully objectives-driven manner. Wisdom necessitates acting in a meaningfully objectives-driven manner. Premise two: God is either perfectly or exceedingly wise. Premise three: deism does not affirm God's intervention in the world. premise 4, God's wisdom is incompatible with his non-intervention in the world. Conclusion, deism is incoherent. Now, this argument takes the form of a syllogism. So meaning we first present some premises or propositions or assumptions which set out to make certain claims. Then based on these claims, we attempt to derive a conclusion. Now, in order for this syllogistic argument to work effectively, 2 things must be fulfilled. First, we must demonstrate the truthfulness or the veracity of the premises themselves. Secondly, the conclusion must logically follow from these premises. So is that the case with this argument here? I would contend that it is. So let's explore some of these premises together. So the first premise states, wisdom necessitates acting in a meaningfully objectives-driven manner. Basically, all this is saying is that if one were to act wisely, then one ought to act in a meaningful manner, which would involve achieving certain objectives. And this premise is actually very straightforward and will not be seriously disputed by deists. Ibn al-Qayyim al-Jawziyya, a classical Islamic scholar, very well known, describes divine wisdom as encapsulating God's desired ends of his creation and commands, for whose purpose he created and legislated. And Ibn al-Wazir, another classical Islamic scholar, articulates God's wisdom as a specific kind of knowledge which God has about unknown benefits, meaning unknown to us human beings, good intellects, and preferable interests. This manifests in the actions of God by transforming from potentiality to reality. So in summary, God's wisdom can be defined as that aspect of his knowledge that wills the actualization of anything which furthers the objectives and goals God set out in his intended act. In other words, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not act in a meaningless manner. There's always a goal or objective underlying Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's actions. Premise 2, God is either perfectly or exceedingly wise. Now, again, the overwhelming majority of deists would also agree with this premise. In fact, I don't think that any deist would seriously dispute it. Deists believe God is the great architect. Now, why do deists even believe in God to begin with? Well, because they recognize that the universe requires a designer, cries out for a designer. They believe in the argument from design, also known as the teleological argument. And the earliest deists actually used to refute the atheists for disbelieving in the existence of God. God's astounding creation reflects the magnitude of his attributes. Now, for God to have meticulously designed the universe as we see it today implies that God is at the very least, exceedingly powerful and knowledgeable. We know God is powerful because God could not have created the universe without the tremendous ability that it demands. And we also know that God is knowledgeable because such an intricate design requires one to be knowledgeable enough to know where everything fits. All in all, the magnificence of the design of the universe reflects the properties of its designer. Therefore, the awesomeness of God's wisdom could easily be inferred simply by observing the universe. And once again, deists would not dispute this. So you don't need to work so hard to validate this premise. Now, before I go on to the next premise, I just want to say something very quickly because some of you might be thinking, why does the premise say that God is either perfectly or exceedingly wise? You know, don't we Muslims believe that God is perfect and infinite in his attributes? Yes, we do. And obviously, we as Muslims affirm that God is perfect in all his attributes. However, the reason why the premise says or exceedingly here is because it requires extra effort to provide a rational argument demonstrating God's attributes to be maximally perfect. And honestly, that's not necessary for the strict purpose of this argument. So we shouldn't be overburdening ourselves when presenting an argument. We don't need to exert unnecessary effort in proving things not essential for a specific argument. So it's enough for the specific purpose of refuting the deist here to simply assume, for the sake of argument alone, that God's attributes could merely be exceedingly great, and that would still suffice for refuting the deist. So I repeat, we Muslims believe that God is perfectly wise and not merely exceedingly wise. That's actually not a valid position to hold as a Muslim. However, only for the purpose of this argument can we be willing to assume it simply for the sake of argument alone, since the perfection of God's attributes isn't a requirement for the effectiveness of this specific argument. Because if the deist will say, how did you rationally deduce that God's wisdom is perfect? Then you're going to get distracted and you're going to get bogged down unnecessarily. And for the specific purpose of this argument, it's not necessary to affirm the perfection of God's wisdom. You could argue for that separately in a different context. Premise 3, deism does not affirm God's intervention in the world. Well, yes, as we just discussed, the central position of deists is that God remains inoperative in and unconcerned with the world he created. So again, this premise won't be disputed. Premise 4, God's wisdom is incompatible with his non-intervention in the world. Now, this premise is the crux of the argument. This is the premise which deists would likely dispute, and is the one in which you would have to exert some effort in proving. Now, the claim the premise is making is this: God not intervening in and being unconcerned with the affairs of his creation is a compromise of his wisdom. Why? Well, first of all, purposeless and meaningless acts are unwise acts. So doing something for no reason at all is by definition unwise. Now, we must ask ourselves, if this designer of the universe is infinitely or extremely wise, then how can this designer, who is so wise enough to create and design this amazing universe, be unwise enough to create it without any purpose? Wise people do things for a reason. If finite human beings such as ourselves don't manufacture or create things for simply no reason whatsoever, what then about this infinitely or exceedingly wise cosmic designer? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, did you think that we created you uselessly and that to us you would not be returned? Does man think that he will be left neglected? And so basically was this God who was so wise enough to be able to create the magnificently designed universe just happened to get bored afterwards and say, oops, I didn't mean to create this universe. Let me just leave it alone there in that corner, as I want nothing to do with it anymore. I mean, to make that leap, it seems like a very huge and baseless leap. And the Quran is nudging us. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the Quran is nudging us and probing us to really reflect upon the viability of such a stance. So in summary, there is tension between believing in a perfectly or exceedingly wise God, which deists acknowledge, and yet also believing that he created this universe without any purpose in mind and without caring about what happens to it, and merely allows it to run its own natural course like a clock. So just to recap the first argument, we'll read out the premises again. Premise one, wisdom necessitates acting in a meaningfully objectives-driven manner. Premise two, God is either perfectly or exceedingly wise. Premise three, deism does not affirm God's intervention in the world. Premise four, God's wisdom is incompatible with his non-intervention in the world. Conclusion, deism is incoherent. So that's the first argument. Deism makes no sense in light of God being an infinitely or even exceedingly wise being. In light of these four premises or claims, the conclusion necessarily follows. Moving on to the second argument, which is basically trying to argue for the incoherence of deism in light of God's moral character. And we're going to be touching upon two different sub-arguments here, because you have deists who believe that God is good, and you all have deists who believe that God is evil. So we're going to have to develop two different arguments to cater to each one. So here we're going to start off by addressing those deists who believe that God is good. And I would say that the majority of modern deists today tend to fit in this camp. So deism's incoherence considering God's good moral character. So just like with the first argument, we're going to first lay out the argument. We're going to lay out the premises and the conclusion, and then we're going to elaborate on them, inshallah. Okay, so the first premise. Premise one, goodness necessitates benevolence and justice. Premise two, deism affirms God's goodness, yet negates his worldly involvement. Premise three, God's goodness is inharmonious with his worldly non-involvement. Conclusion, deism is incoherent. Now, the first premise is not really controversial. Deists would agree that to be good to others implies being benevolent or kind to others while also treating them justly. Regarding the second premise, deists differ over this, as I just said. So some deists claim that God is good while others do not. So this specific argument addresses those deists who do affirm that God is good. So, and we'll deal with those that say God is evil separately in the next section, inshallah. So the crux of the argument here really lies in premise number three, which states that to simultaneously affirm that God is good while he remains disinterested and uninvolved in the affairs of his creation is problematic. Now, this is the critical premise which these deists would likely disagree with. Now here we need to ask an important question. How can a God who created us and ignores our prayers and neglects us without providing us with any clear moral guidance and willingly refuses to communicate with us to give us direction and hope, be a good God? Now, let's remember something here. What do deists say? Deists say that we should only determine what is good based on our reason alone. Correct? Well, doesn't our reason, as limited as it is, tell us that those who abandon those under their care without justification are immoral? Right? So is it a man who abandons his family without a legitimate excuse a bad father and husband? Well, of course he is. In a similar fashion, how can the deist logically deem that his conception of God is good when our reason tells us that he's in fact bad? Didn't the deistic God create us and then abandon us? Well, yes, that's what deists believe. Therefore, the deistic God cannot be good according to our faculty of reason, the same faculty of reason, which deists insist that we use in order to determine what is good and bad. Now, we Muslims don't agree with this deistic standard of moral reasoning. We Muslims recognize that we can't determine everything that's good and bad purely based on our reason alone. Let alone could we subject God to our human standards of moral reasoning. However, what we're doing here with this argument is that we are merely demanding deists to be consistent by subjecting them to their own standards of moral reasoning. So we're basically saying to the deist, okay, you want to use reason alone to determine what is good and bad. Fine. But in light of that, you must consistently acknowledge that your God is not good. And so just to reiterate the argument, goodness necessitates benevolence and justice. Premise 2, deism affirms God's goodness yet negates his worldly involvement. Premise 3, God's goodness is inharmonious with his worldly non-involvement. Conclusion, deism is incoherent. So in light of these three premises, then, the conclusion follows that deism is incoherent, because on the one hand, it's trying to affirm that God is good, yet its insistence that we limit ourselves to our finite reason in order to determine what is good and bad pushes us to conclude that this deistic God is in fact bad. So there is irreconcilable tension here. Now, I did mention that there are deists who believe that God is not good, is evil. So how do we argue against those deists? So when it comes to these deists, so this will be deism's incoherence considering God's evil moral character. So once again, I'll be laying out the argument and then I'll be elaborating on it. So the first premise, objective morality exists. Premise 2, objective morality cannot exist if God is evil. Premise 3, deism affirms that God is evil. Conclusion, deism is incoherent. Now, when it comes to the first premise, I mean, what this premise means is that moral value judgments, what does it mean for objective morality to exist? It basically means that moral value judgments have a real truth to them. So if I say that treating someone unjustly is immoral, I do not simply mean that it's subjectively immoral, but rather that it's actually, in reality, immoral. It really is immoral. And most deists would agree with this premise. I mean, they actually believe that there is such a real thing as good and evil. In fact, they claim to reject organized religions such as Islam and Christianity precisely because they believe that all these religions are supposedly objectively evil. So this premise is not in dispute. Now, when it comes to the second premise, objective morality cannot exist if God is evil. This premise is critical to the argument. So, first of all, if I believe in a God who is evil, then I know that he would not care about whatever evil that I do. Secondly, what becomes our objective moral standard if God himself did not instill objective moral worth into things? So, morality then would be reduced to whatever rules human beings concoct for themselves. But who is to say which human beings' rules are superior to others? The Nazis had their own moral beliefs. Why weren't they correct? Similarly, the ancient Aztecs used to sacrifice children to their gods. On what basis can we say that they did something wrong? It's also said that many Eskimos believe that it's okay to sleep with other people's wives. well, I mean, who has the objective authority to say that all this is wrong? The problem is that it's impossible to truly have an objective moral standard of good unless that objective standard transcends in authority over all things and serves as an authoritative moral reference point. However, if God is evil or amoral, morally neutral, without morality, sorry, amoral, not immoral, amoral, then he can't serve as that sufficient standard. Premise 3, deism affirms that God is evil. So as I said, this specific argument is focusing on these deists who do believe that God is evil. And yeah, so just to recap the argument. So premise 1, objective morality exists. Premise 2, objective morality cannot exist if God is evil. Premise 3, deism affirms that God is evil. Conclusion, deism is incoherent. So the conclusion logically follows, and the bulk of us agree with premise 1, right? That objective morality exists, that things could be truly right and truly wrong. And what do we mean by objective? Just to elaborate further on this argument, right? So what do we mean by objective? We mean that something is necessarily or inherently good or evil, regardless of what anyone says. So even if the British Empire, successfully colonized and brainwashed the entire world to accept its moral authority, and it killed off everyone who so that whoever remained alive spoke positively about the British Empire's moral code, the reality would be is that the British Empire still did something evil in reality, even if all the people on Earth who were alive said that it's something good. So that's what an objective moral value judgment would entail, that it is inherently true, regardless of what any human being says. Now, when it comes to premise 2, again, as argued, you cannot have objective morality while believing that God is evil, because if God's evil, then you're left with no alternative transcendental moral authority by which you can appeal to as an objective moral standard, via which to judge all actions and people. And since these deists believe God is evil, they cannot simultaneously claim to believe in objective morality. However, they do claim to believe in objective morality, hence there is tension in their worldview, and their stance is clearly incoherent. Coming to the third argument, which basically talks about the likelihood of revelation. So, as we said, deists reject the idea of divine revelation. They believe that there's no need for it, and this argument has to do with the likelihood and probability of revelation itself. So if we can show very good reasons, for thinking why God would send down revelation, that this would severely weaken the deistic case. Now, this argument would mostly work against deists who affirm that God is both wise and good. So if the deist affirms that God is both wise and good, and the bulk of them do, then these arguments have a good chance of working against them. So the question here is, are there good reasons for thinking that God would send revelation to humanity? And I'd say absolutely. And alhamdulillah, as I was sifting through the books of the classical ulama, I was able to compile a good number of arguments on this front. But just for the sake of time, let me just mention 4. So the first one is that divine revelation clarifies the moral commands of God. Now, many deists would say that God does command us to be good, especially the classical deists, the early ones. However, God expects us to know what is good through natural revelation or through the strict use of our reason. Now, keeping aside the fact that it doesn't make sense for God to command us to be good and simultaneously not care about our universe, keeping that aside, we could say, okay, yes, it's possible. It's possible based on reason alone to perhaps agree on, to come to agreement that on some broad or universal moral principles, like things like it's good to be just, or sexual ethics are important, or freedom of conscience is praiseworthy, and so on. However, when it comes to the moral particulars, or when it comes to the particular and specific understanding and application of these broad moral universals or broad moral principles, people strongly differ with each other. And on the other hand, divine revelation helps clarify what specific understanding of these broad moral principles, such as justice and freedom of conscience and ethics, we should be having. And even though we may have disagreements regarding the interpretation of some parts of revelation at times, the fact is that divine revelation has still effectively drawn some clear, definitive boundaries and narrowed the scope for healthy disagreement. The second reason is that divine revelation can disclose matters that are inaccessible by our unaided reason. So divine revelation can disclose matters that are inaccessible by our unaided reason. So based on our reason alone, we can't know for certain if God expects us to worship him or not, or let alone if there's even a specific way he wants us to worship him. Based on our reason alone, we can't know for certain if there is an afterlife, or divine judgment, or a path to salvation, which we're supposed to follow. However, revelation could usefully aid us in coming to know these things. Third point is that divine revelation clarifies the nature of our relationship with God. What is the nature of our relationship with God? Is it one of friendship? Similar to how Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam is referred to as Khalilullah, the friend of Allah, or is it one of alliance? Are we the allies of Allah? Are we the awliyaullah? Or is it one of servitude? Are we ibadullah? Or is it a combination of all these things, or some of these things, or none of these things? Or is it like how some Christians say, that there's some sort of spiritual childlike relationship with God, that we are his spiritual children, that we're the sons of God? Well, revelation could really assist us in knowing this. Fourth reason is that divine revelation justifies the moral accountability of sinners. Now, if there is a divine judgment, well, then many sinners and non-believers, and by the way, a big number of deists do believe in an afterlife. They do believe that there is divine judgment. They do believe that the worst of the worst, some of them do believe in a hell, that they believe in a divine afterlife. That a lot of them do affirm this. So, but if there is a divine judgment, then many sinners and non-believers could argue back against God on the day of judgment by saying that he never warned them, because he never sent them a revelation clarifying what his demands were. That they had no idea that he even wanted them to abide by a certain moral code or to adopt specific theological beliefs. However, with revelation, that excuse isn't available to the non-believer. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, وَمَا كُنَّا مُعَذِّبِينَ حَتَّى نَبْعَثَ رَسُولًا. we wouldn't punish the people unless we sent them a messenger. So that's sort of an exemplification of Allah's attribute of justice. And so with the warning by the messenger having been given through divine revelation, those who did injustice could be fairly held morally accountable. So, I mean, just to conclude with some final remarks. First, I would want to recommend some resources. So, now the first thing is that I would like to recommend my lengthy article, a critique of deism. Now, of course, this presentation is a very simplified and top level overview of the essential points mentioned in the article. But the article is very valuable because it dives into potential rebuttals and counter rebuttals to the arguments that I presented to you. So if you're going to be having a discussion on this subject with an informed person or audience, then it's advisable that you give it a read and fully digest the material so that you're better prepared. The second resource is religion becoming outdated? So this is an article that I just recently published just a few days ago. And in that article, I critique this notion of secular spirituality, this idea that we could attain spirituality without religion. So this new age do-it-yourself spirituality is something that I focus on critiquing in the article, and I lay out several reasons why the optimal context for pursuing spirituality is religion itself, and that religion and theology is extremely essential for pursuing spirituality. The third resource is a lecture on YouTube of mine that you can find, Deconstructing Religious Pluralism. So in that lecture, I talk about the notion of religious salvific pluralism, and I discuss it first from an Islamic perspective, scripturally, and then I proceed on to address rational arguments in favor of salvific religious pluralism. And the fourth resource is a lecture that I also gave quite recently. You can find it on YouTube, The Rationale of Hell in Islam. So basically, it's a very lengthy video. It's also transcribed for those who prefer to read. Basically, in this lecture, I address some of the most popular and substantive arguments against the notion of hell, and I kind of dive into it in detail. And so I think all these four resources will be very useful for you. These are all interlinked and interconnected, as you could imagine, and they all fall under this wider umbrella of opposition towards religion. And I think if you consult these four resources and really digest the material, I think you'll have inshallah, a very robust and strong grounding in this subject, and you'll be able to discuss these issues with much more confidence. Another thing that we have to bear in mind is that we need to treat matters on a case-by-case basis. So, as I said, deists hold different opinions regarding certain theological stances. You need to make sure that you clarify from the deist that you're speaking to about what he or she believes before making any assumptions of your own. All right, and look, this presentation and my articles and my lectures, they tend to take a very intellectual approach to these subjects. They're meant to provide you with the intellectual arsenal, so to speak, required to deconstruct deism. However, in dawah, please remember that things are much more complicated than what meets the eye. A lot of people who are deists might outwardly pretend like they have intellectual doubts, but in reality, their problems might be more emotional. For example, someone might be fed up with Islam or organized religion in general because of very poor experiences with religious people. or perhaps because they feel that deism offers them a path to live their lives freely without having to abide by any religious rules. It could be for a number of reasons. And so you just have to remember that critical point. I mean, if anything, my personal experience has taught me that emotions tend to be the main reason why people struggle with religion. Um, and lastly, and it goes without saying that hidayah, guidance, only comes by the will of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. I mean, these intellectual arguments are nothing but a means through which we pray that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bestows guidance upon those whose difficulties and struggles truly and sincerely are intellectual in nature. And yeah, and with that, I conclude my presentation. Barakallahu fikum for listening, and I'll be happy to entertain any questions at this point. Jazakallahu khairah.
Jazakallah khairan, Ustaz, for enlightening us. Now we are going to begin the question and answer session. This will be very brief. The questions will be taken through the chat box. The chat box is open now. You can send your questions to me or our co-host Nahian Choudhury. We will read the questions aloud and Ustaz will answer them, inshallah. So if you have any questions, you can send them to me or our co-host Nahian Choudhury. Then we will read the questions and Ustaz will answer them, inshallah. But please, it's a request, don't ask questions that are not related to today's topic. Please stay on the topic. So we have got the first question right now.
Am I able to see these questions, or
Ustaz, if they
are they coming to you privately?
If they send the questions to you, you will be able to see them. But if they send the questions to any other co-host, you won't be able to see them. But we will read the questions to you.
Okay.
Okay. So the first question is, what about deists who think God is just a blind force with no wisdom or moral property?
What about deists who believe that God is simply a blind force? Is that the question?
With no wisdom or moral property.
If a God that is simply a blind force without wisdom would be a God that has no consciousness, that has no mind, that has no will. And in order to create the universe, the being that created the universe must know where everything fits. So it must have knowledge in order to know where everything fits and to know how to create this universe. And it must also have power. And with that knowledge and that will, it would be able to, that being would be able to effectively direct that power in order to actualize the intended objectives, such as creation of the universe. So an entity that is merely a blind force or that lacks willpower would not be one that would be able to create the universe such as ours. And it would not even be a moral agent. So the arguments that we laid out in terms of the objectivity of moral values would also apply here.
Moving on to the next question. What would you recommend as a starter to show Islam is true to the deists?
That's a lengthy topic, and I guess we were focusing more on critiquing deism here rather than trying to proffer evidences for Islam. I don't think that there is any specific method of trying to prove Islam to a deist compared to trying to prove that Islam is true to any other non-Muslim. I think when it comes to evidences for Islam, you'll find that Muslims would differ on their approach in this subject. I have my own kind of method that I follow, and other Muslim apologists follow their own different methods as well, in terms of which arguments that they would like to highlight and prioritize in terms of strength and capacity to convince non-Muslims to believe that Islam is true. I think that is worthy of a separate lecture on its own. But if the question is there a specific way to recommend that demonstrate that Islam is true to deists in particular, I do not necessarily think that there's a specific method that I would follow.
Okay, the next question is, can a deist be agnostic about the epistemic weight of revelation?
Can a deist be an agnostic about the epistemic weight of revelation? I guess I'm trying to understand what the question is. If the question is, if the question is trying to say, can a deist be neutral in terms of believing whether God would send revelation to us or not? I think it's perhaps it's theoretically possible. I guess someone could say, I do not believe that God has sent down revelation, but I'm open to the idea that he possibly may send us revelation. That could be theoretically possible, but I don't know if we're even talking about deism anymore, because deists typically take a very proactive and affirmative stance when they say that God does not intervene in the world. I mean, that is what deism is. That they would assert that God does not intervene in the world, and that's how they know. That's how they know why none of the religions, organized religions, divine religions, are true, and they actually advance arguments in favor of that. So that's typically the stance that they hold, that natural revelation, quote unquote, natural revelation, meaning we come to know of theological and moral truth through the strict use of our reason, is the epistemic method that we follow, that is meant to be followed, and that is that is one of the that is a core element of their beliefs. When it comes to the whole idea, can they believe that God may send revelation in the future? I do tackle that in the article. You know, I actually say, what if they say, well, maybe God hasn't sent nothing so far, but he said something, he may send something in the future. Actually, I'll tackle that in the article, and that's something that you could, you know, refer back to as well. I hope I interpreted the question correctly. I hope that's how I interpreted it.
So the question is,
Yeah.
what if a deist disputes the statement that non-meaningful acts are unwise?
Can you say that again? What if he disputes
the statement that non-meaningful acts are unwise?
Well, I would simply appeal to our intuitions that, you know, for something to be wise would entail that whatever it is we're talking about has an underlying meaning and purpose to it. You know, if we say, hey, Ahmed, that was a wise decision that you made, you know, are we talking about something meaningless or something meaningful here? That the reason why you made a wise decision, Ahmed, was because I don't know, there's no meaning to it? Or when you said, oh, hey, Ahmed, you made a wise decision, you meant to say, yeah, the decision that you did actually ended up actualizing the objectives and goals that you set out to attend, or actually even beyond your expectations. The point is that we deem things to be wise for a reason, and it usually entails the actualization and the realization of certain goals and objectives. But to say that something non-meaningful could be wise, I just think it's so self-evident that this is false. I would ask everyone to just ask themselves, whenever you use the word wise to describe something, what do you actually mean by that? Are you actually referring to something meaningless? Surely not. Surely not. So what then of speaking about an exceedingly or an infinitely wise designer of this universe? And so again, I'm just trying to play the game that the deist likes to play, right? You want to make yourself out to be all rational, and you want to use rationality to advance your worldview. Okay, let's play the rationality game. And I just don't think that your arguments are and your stances are tenable. And that's all I'm basically trying to say to the deist here.
Moving on to our next question. How do we refute the idea God created us like a machine in which we are operating like the machines, like the artificial intelligence? We can operate ourselves automatically.
Sorry, is the question saying, how do we know we're not?
No. The question is saying, how do we refute the idea God created us like a machine in which we can operate ourselves automatically, like artificial intelligence?
How do we refute the idea that God created us like machines in which we could take care of ourselves? I mean, I don't. I think the deistic position is saying something more than that. It's not just saying, "Oh, God created us and just let us be." It's saying that God created us and neglected our universe, because that's the key argument that forms the basis of why they are strongly against the notion of divine intervention and miracles. It is upon that basis. Once they say, "Oh, maybe God could intervene," then they cannot assert their stance confidently. So they're not just simply saying God created us and just let us operate on our own, and for us to figure things out by ourselves, even though that is still a problematic idea, especially when it comes to figuring out what God wants from us, and to determine moral particulars, and to figure out the nature of a relationship with God. Clearly, we're not able to come to terms on these critical questions in the absence of divine revelation. But they're also saying that God does not care about our universe. He abandoned the universe. And so that is going beyond the claim that God just created us, as machines to take care of ourselves. Clearly, if we were like machines, then we would expect some sort of uniformity in thought, just as you would install and input some instructions into a machine. You would figure that the machine would act in line with what you input and how you configured it. But clearly, we are human beings, and we are more complex than machines, and we do not operate like machines. And I think it's just self-evidently wrong. And I would expect that the deist present his arguments in favor of why he thinks this is true, rather than I having to carry the burden of disproving that I'm not making the affirmative claim. He is.
Moving on to the next question. Is deism more common in the modern era? If so, what's about the modern era that made it common?
Is reason not common in the modern era?
Is deism more common in the modern era?
Is deism more common in the modern era? And then what's the second part of the question?
If so, what is the reason behind it?
Yeah, I mean, actually, if you read my article, is religion becoming outdated? I list a number of reasons for why non-religious views of religion are growing. I would say that there's probably a number of reasons. I would say a lot of it is mainly sociological and experiential. So very bad experiences with religious people. I would also say that a lot of these grievances with religion are probably legitimate, right? They're probably legitimate. I mean, people are. I will not come to the defense of problematic doctrines like how we see in Christianity, for example, like defending the notion of the Trinity and the incarnation. I mean, a lot of people who've abandoned religion have struggled, with these doctrines and struggled with the Bible as well. So some grievances might be very legitimate. There's also the Enlightenment thinkers have also been quite successful, and this has been passed down to our time in modifying the criteria that people should be using to assess the strength or validity of a religion. So instead of looking at theological doctrines, they push people to instead look at to focus on different notions like human rights and ethics and whatnot. And with the dominance of these Western hegemonies and them pushing and propagating their thoughts and their across the world, they have quite successfully set the standard that people are expected to follow when it comes to morality. And when a lot of people look at the religions that they follow, they feel that it's not aligning with that dominant moral standard. And this is actually very natural. This is even when you look back in history, a lot of people, when they're living during a time where different powers were different empires were the dominant force, a lot of people tried to appease that dominant force. I mean, we even witnessed this in the Islamic caliphates and the empires, where many non-Muslims who were living under these Islamic empires were trying really hard to get in the good books of Muslims. So you even had Christians and Jews who would go far and beyond what their religion permitted and would say things like, oh yeah, we believe that Muhammad was a prophet, but we only believe that he was sent to the Arabs, right? So they didn't want to come across as being too hostile or to Islam. Why? Because Islam was a dominant force at the time, and the inferiority complex kicks in, and a lot of people tend to feel under pressure. It's just it tends that's what tends to happen, and I think that's also a reason why people are gravitating away from religion, because they're seeing that it's the scientific thing to do, it's the rational thing to do, it's the hip thing to do. There are a different number of reasons, but again, I would ask you to maybe go back to my article, is religion becoming outdated? I actually cite some sources and a list of reasons for why people are shifting away from religion. I think you'll find that answer to be more wholesome than what I just provided right now.
How do the deists define God? How do the deists define God? And what is the majority view? And where do they differ most?
How do they defend God? Do you mean how do they
define
God?
And what is the majority view? And where do they differ most?
It's really difficult to pinpoint on what the majority view is, because there isn't an actual organized deistic movement, where there are prominent thought leaders or prophets, quote unquote, or doctrinal books. I mean, there's no sacred book of deism, right? They don't have a holy book. They don't have prophets. They don't have. So it's difficult, whenever. That's why I said in the conclusion, and that's why I said in the beginning of my presentation, they're not monolithic. And even in the conclusion, you have to make sure you find out what the guy believes. Every time I speak to a deist, I get surprised by the kinds of beliefs that they hold, right? I was even speaking to a professor who teaches in New York, and he's a deist. And he was telling me, I'm a deist, and I believe that God is very loving and wants to have a relationship with us. And I believe in salvation. And I'm like, whoa, you sound like a Christian. What kind of deist are you? And when you read and study about all these different deistic movements, now it would have been easier. It would have been much easier to probably answer that question if we're talking about deists in the first 70 years of their inception, because we do have the writings and thoughts of the major pillars of that movement during the English Enlightenment and French Enlightenment period. But today, there are no major prominent deistic speakers, so I wouldn't be able to answer that question. That's why. But that's the definition that I provided is what they tend to have in common, and so we work with that. We work with that substantive definition. And every time you speak to a deist, you're going to have to ask them, what is it exactly do you believe? Some of them believe in an afterlife. Some of them don't believe in an afterlife. Some of them believe in hell and heaven. Some of them don't believe in hell and heaven. And unfortunately, there's no poll or research study that I could allude to that kind of answers that question credibly.
Moving on to our last question. So this question is a bit long, so I am sending you as a message, and I'm also reading, but I'm sending you as a message. You can check the chat box.
Okay. Is it the one that says, what if someone argues? Is it that one? Do you hear me, Nahian? I think you're on mute.
Yes, that one.
Okay,
So
that one.
I'm
All right.
repeating
What if
the question.
I could read it? What if someone argues against objective morality, that we can adopt those principles which make the human species survive longer and flourish, and reject those principles which are against our development, and the powerful of this earth will always apply their principles or morals and either succeed or fail, and the world can go on like this, and we will ultimately know someday what really works. Yeah, I mean, so basically, as some philosophers have described this, you're not even, these are not even moral values anymore. These are prudential values, meaning if you come along and say, okay, guys, let's abide by these set of moral codes because it will enable us human beings to collectively flourish and to live longer and to be healthier and stronger and to be more happy in this life. And those will be our moral values. In reality, those are not really moral values. These are prudential values, meaning these are things that you have decided that you want to do because they are prudent. They are prudent for your survival, because they are prudent in order to attain and achieve certain goals. Well, just because they are prudent to achieve these certain goals, that still doesn't answer the question why those goals are morally good to begin with. And especially when it comes to and this is also presuming that collective human flourishing takes precedence over individual liberties or individual and selfish goals to supersede everyone else and to only look out for ourselves. I mean, this is a hugely debated topic in different spheres of politics today. So here, what would stop the rich and powerful who have many more resources than the majority of people from coming and saying, you know what, I don't really care about the survival of the masses of the human beings. I have my own resources and I have my own power that I've attained, and I'm perfectly happy where I am. I don't need to cooperate with anybody else. It's not prudent for me to flourish, the rich and powerful, by cooperating with the rest of human beings. I'm perfectly happy where I am, and that's it. And so how can you then go ahead and say, hey, you're doing something immoral here, you're doing something wrong here? Because not everyone's going to agree with this principle to begin with. And who even said that this is a universal principle that is clearly evident to everyone? A lot of people are, care about themselves. A lot of people are very person-centric, as opposed to communitarian, in the sense that they care about the larger community and cooperating and acting in ways to help the community flourish at a collective level. And so these values get reduced down to prudential values and they are not recognized as moral values anymore. And this could even be debunked even further by saying that even if you could demonstrate that this is an objective moral value, you haven't demonstrated without a transcendental moral authority that this is even a moral duty. Okay, so this could be an objective moral value, but who has the authority to make it a duty for you to abide by this objective moral value, if not a transcendent moral agent? And much more could be said, but we'll take some time doing that. And so I just hope the gist of the response was clear and useful, inshallah.
So we are ending our question and answer session. So I think this is the end of this session, this webinar. Thank you, Ustadh, for your amazing webinar.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me, and thank you to everyone who took time off from their busy schedules to come and attend this lecture. Appreciate all of you brothers and sisters who've attended, and thank you for the great questions as well. And inshallah ta'ala, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, keep us steadfast and upon the path of guidance, and enable us to be agents through which he could help us to guide others to his truth, inshallah. Barakallahu feekum.